So we've taken a look at different definitions of stress, and we've looked at the distinction between the stressor, which is the cause, and stress, which is the outcome or the effect. And you can look at these in a number of different ways in research. And so that's what we'll be taking a look at next, is how the concept, or what we call construct, of stress and the construct of a stressor, these abstract concepts, how we take them and produce them in a lab or measure them in our research. Those are known as operational definitions, the set of procedures that are used in a study to measure or produce a construct of interest, in this case, stress. So operational definitions are very precise, they're very concrete. And we'll look at some examples of these. One way to study stress is to have a researcher bring people into a lab, a participant into a lab, and expose them to a situation or have them engage in a task that produces stress. And this is what's known as the acute stress paradigm. So it's pretty artificial, but you bring a person into a lab and you subject them to something that will likely induce stress. Now, in the old days, they used to use a lot of physical stressors, and one example of that is the cold presser task. In the cold presser task, the participant puts their hand into a bucket of ice water, and they can pull that out. That's basically the only way that they can get rid of the stressor. So it was used to really study passive coping. What do you do when you can't have active control over this thing that you're experiencing, the stressor that you're experiencing? So that's an example of a physical task. A psychological task that's been used in the acute stress paradigm and that's commonly used is mental arithmetic. Mental arithmetic is what it sounds like, doing math in your head. The participant is with an experimenter. The experimenter tells them, start at this number, something like 4,731, count backwards by sevens as quickly as you can. Do it aloud. And so they start doing that mental arithmetic. They report their answers to the experimenter. If they get something wrong, the experimenter tells them to start over. If they're doing okay, the experimenter asks them to go faster. And usually this is a task that at some point the participant perceives as taxing or exceeding their resources. Now, there's also, in addition to just the mental stress, the psychological stress of trying to cognitively figure out that math task, it's a social stressor as well, because you're with an experimenter and you feel obligated to perform the task as well as you can. And so there's an inherently social part of it. But researchers have also examined other kinds of social stressors by using social tasks. And one of those paradigms is the Trier social stress test protocol. So this is a series of tasks, and we'll take a look at what is involved in that. First of all, participant goes into the waiting room and they wait for 20 to 30 minutes to get baseline measures. In these tests, they are often looking at physiological responses. They might be looking at hormone levels. They might be looking at heart rate and blood pressure, but they are given a chance to get used to the waiting room, relax, get things set up with whatever equipment, and they wait 20 to 30 minutes so they can get some baseline measurements. Then they're taken into a different room, a separate interview room, and the experimenter reads a script about the upcoming tasks and gives them instructions for what's going to happen next. And they use a script so that they do this the same way for every single participant. Then the participant is told that they're going to be giving an impromptu speech. And so the participant is given 10 minutes to prepare the speech. They have this 10-minute speech preparation period. When the experimenter goes away, the participant is left alone in this interview room to prepare their speech. It's usually about something that's fairly mundane, but it will take some time to come up with some ideas, and it usually is something that people perceive as a stressful situation. Then the researcher returns, and this time the researcher is wearing a lab coat, and this is to increase the intimidation factor. Often they have the researcher carrying a clipboard, they're seated in front of the participant, and the participant delivers this 5-minute speech that they've prepared. During this time, the researcher is writing on their clipboard, looking somewhat disapprovingly or neutrally at best at the participant, and it's a fairly stressful interaction. Then they do a 5-minute mental arithmetic task, which I've already explained. And then they take what's called the State Trait Anxiety Inventory. This is a questionnaire that's used to measure 2 types of anxiety. One type is what's called state anxiety. In other words, how anxious are you feeling right now at this moment? The other type of anxiety it measures is trait anxiety. And this is more of a personality characteristic. In general, how anxious do you tend to be? Do you tend to be pretty anxious? Do you tend to be lower in anxiety? And then they spend 20 minutes back in the original waiting room recovering, so they get to rest and get back to their original baseline levels. So that's the Trier Social Stress Test Protocol. Other ways to measure stress or to study stress include not inducing stress in a lab situation, but just measuring the existing levels of stress that people are experiencing. And one method for doing that is to examine the stressful life events people have experienced within the past 6 months or so. And we'll take a look at an example of this type of measure. This is the Holmes and Ray Social Readjustment Scale. It was published in 1967. Participants go through this list and they check the number of things that they've experienced within the past 6 months. And then they get a score for each of these events. So you can see if you've had a business readjustment, you get a score of 39. Divorce, a score of 75. So one of the things that you might notice when looking at this list is that there are negative events here, like dismissal from work, death of a close friend, change in sleeping or eating habits. Those could be negative, but there are also positive things here, like beginning or ending school and outstanding personal achievement. And this shows us that positive events can also cause stress. This measure, results of this measure, are positively correlated with physical health outcomes. People who have higher scores on the Holmes and Ray Social Readjustment Scale tend to have more health problems. So it is predictive of health problems. Another thing that you might notice here is that it really doesn't take into account how a person might perceive a particular event or the circumstances surrounding the event. So let's look at an example. Let's look at pregnancy. Pregnancy can be seen in different ways depending on the individual. For some people, a pregnancy is a welcome event. It's something that they have planned, that they've hoped for, that they're excited about. They feel financially ready. They feel like their relationship is stable. For other people, a pregnancy is not a good event, not a positive event. It's unexpected. And they're worried about their relationships. They might be worried about the financial implications. They might be worried about the impact it might have on their future. But regardless of the specifics and how the individual perceives that event, both of those types of individuals would get a score of 40 for that particular event. So it doesn't take individual perceptions into account. It also doesn't take into account that not all the things that cause stress are major life events. It's not all about changing to a different line of work or changing your work hours or going on vacation. There are things we encounter every day that lead to stress. So we can ask people about their major life events and ask them about retrospective accounts. So if they think about when they started college, for example, we can ask college seniors to talk about the stress they experienced, or when people are dealing with really stressful life transitions, we can ask them to reflect on that. Another source of stress are daily hassles. Daily hassles are those little things that overall, the more of them you have, the more you perceive them as taxing or exceeding your resources and possibly endangering your well-being. And we'll look at some examples of daily hassles. These would be like misplacing or losing things. Misplacing your keys is not a major life event, but it is something that can add to, it's a stressor that can add to the stress of daily life. Having troublesome neighbors. They might be noisy, or they might park their car in a way that it blocks your driveway. And those aren't major life events, but again, it adds to your stress. Traffic, heavy traffic in your commute, getting stuck in traffic. Weather problems, technology problems. These are things that might be pretty minor. They might even be things that you could solve, but they add up. And there are scales that measure people's daily hassles and how often they encounter them and how problematic they are to them. And higher scores on the daily hassle scale do have a correlation with health outcomes. Another real life kind of example that's a naturalistic way to study stress is by looking at individuals who experience chronic stress. They might be in very high stress jobs. For example, healthcare workers or air traffic controllers, or other types of stressful situations like taking care of a person who has dementia, or it might be dealing with one's own chronic illness, and looking at how people deal with the ongoing stress of those kinds of situations on a daily basis. And then finally, what I'll mention is physiological measurements. We know that one definition of stress is a physiological definition of stress, that stress we measure through stress hormones like cortisol or epinephrine. We measure it through increases in heart rate, increases in blood pressure, and we use that often as an outcome to indicate higher levels of stress. These are all ways to operationally define stress. All are specific procedures that can be used to either measure existing levels of stress, measure responses to stressful events, or to induce stress. In the different definitions of stress that we've looked at, the one that is most commonly used in health psychology talks about it as a relationship between the person and their environment. And it's really how the person appraises or perceives or construes a specific situation. An example could be someone who has to get up and give a speech in front of other people. For some people, that is really, really stressful. It's a big stressor. They might worry about it the night before. They might feel sick to their stomach about it. When they get up to give their speech, they're sweating, their face is all blotchy, their mouth is dry. Another person might have the exact same situation, exact same type of speech, exact same setting, but it's not a stressor for them because they're used to it or they're comfortable with it. So how someone appraises the situation is important. And we talk about two types of appraisal when we talk about the appraisal process in stress. And the first is, what does this event mean? And it's what's known as primary appraisal. And there are a number of different types of primary appraisals that exist. One is this a threat? So we'll take an example of losing one's job. So if you lose your job, you get fired, is that something that will threaten your well-being? If you think about, oh, now I'm not going to be able to pay my rent. Now I'm not going to be able to buy groceries. For some people, it would be a big threat. For a lot of people, it would be a big threat. For others, if they feel more financially secure, they have a lot of savings, they feel like they can get another job pretty quickly, they might not perceive it as such a big threat. A second type of appraisal could relate to harm. So threat is more of what's going to happen in the future. Am I worried about how this is going to affect me in the future? Harm is the harm that's already been done. So if someone gets fired from their job, they might think that the harm that's been done is now they don't have a good relationship with their previous employer and it'll be difficult to get a good recommendation. So they've harmed that relationship. They've burned that bridge. But another type of primary appraisal is challenge. People could see a situation like losing one's job as a challenge. Well, now this gives me an opportunity to try something new or to retrain or to find another way to deal with these hardships. So the primary appraisal is the appraisal of the event itself. Is it something that threatens my well-being sometime in the future, either the near future or farther out? Is it something that has already caused harm? Is it something that I can see in a more positive light as a challenge? Secondary appraisals then are appraisals of how one can deal with the stressor and possibly manage it. What kinds of coping resources are available? So if one loses one's job, do they have other kinds of job leads? Do they think, oh, I can contact my aunt and she knows people who could maybe connect me with people I could find out about jobs from? Or who can I talk to about this? Or I have savings, I can tap into my savings, or I can ask my family for help, or I have a spouse who has a job. Or I can take that vacation that I've wanted to take for a long time. So primary appraisals include things like, is this relevant to me? Is this something that is going to have an impact on me? Is it something that's threatening? And then what are the coping resources that are available? What can I do? So, the stressor, is it something that's intense? Is it something that's repeated? Is it unpredictable, uncontrollable? Does it cause quite a bit of pressure? Those all relate to those dimensions of the stressors that I talked about before. So this appraisal relates to perceived stress, and this is an example of the perceived stress scale by Cohen and colleagues. This one was published in 1983. There are different versions. This one is a brief one, 4-item scale. And just to take a look at these, one item is, in the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? And this is usually answered on a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 meaning not at all and 5 meaning frequently. And when people answer a higher number to this, they are saying that they're experiencing more stress. Now, some of these are reverse scored, which means that if you give a higher answer, you say more frequently, then you are talking about lower levels of stress. Like number 2, in the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? In the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? That's another reverse scored one. And in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? What you might notice from this scale is it really does get to appraisals. It gets to perceptions and individual construals rather than saying, did you experience marriage? Did you go on vacation? Did you lose your job? So it doesn't talk about daily hassles specifically. It doesn't talk about major life events specifically. It's really getting to perceptions. How does the individual perceive what's been happening? And it might be that they've had a major life event that's been stressful, or maybe they haven't experienced a major life event like moving or changing jobs or losing a loved one, but they've had lots of little things that have occurred that have really piled up and they're having a hard time handling it. So this really fits in well with Lazarus and Folkman's definition of stress as a relationship between the person and the environment. And it's the perception of the individual. Is this exceeding my resources? Is it taxing my resources? Is it endangering my well-being? So that's a little bit about operational definitions of stress, how we measure it. It might be through self-report, like the perceived stress scale or the Holmes and Ray social readjustment scale. It might be through looking at physiological measures, and it could be inducing stress. And we'll see examples of that as we look at other examples of research in stress and the longer-term effects of stress as well. So next time we'll take a look at some of the physiological responses to stress and how that can have an impact on longer-term health.